There are few that now recall the death of Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson, Ulster Unionist MP for North Down, murdered on 22nd June 1922. At the time of his death, Wilson was one of the most prominent defenders of the Union and one of the most distinguished public figures of his day. His disappearance from public consciousness is particularly unfortunate, as there are so many lessons from his life and death which are as striking today as they would have been at the time. Henry Hughes Wilson was born in County Longford in 1864, the second son of James G. Wilson. He was widely regarded as an Ulsterman by his opponents and would probably have welcomed the term, as all his family ties were with Ulster. His family owned land in County Antrim, and an ancestor, Captain Frank Wilson, had been present at the siege of Londonderry. Other members of his family had served in Mitchelburn's regiment during the siege. His military career did not begin auspiciously. He had to enter the army through the militia, having twice failed the exams for Woolwich and Sandhurst staff colleges. His army career began in the Rifle Brigade during the Burma campaign of 1886 to 1888 when he was wounded, and he subsequently served in the Boer War, where he rose to the rank of Brevet Lieutenant Colonel and was awarded the DSO and the Queen's Medal. His military career from 1903 to 1910 was in military education and training, and he ultimately rose to be Commandant of the Staff College. As one of the few officers who had emerged from the Boer War with any great credit, and who was subsequently responsible for strategic training and planning, Wilson's role in the British campaign in the Great War was of key importance. From an early stage, he took the view that Britain's safety depended on an alliance with France. This was by no means a universal analysis of events pre-1914, and Wilson did not escape criticism for what was perceived as unduly close links with the French General Staff. His tactical vision was such that it marked him out from the usual military mindset, and he quickly had the ear of Lloyd George and Churchill. His willingness to think the unthinkable led his opponents to dismiss Wilson as a warmonger, but subsequent events proved his analysis to have been uncannily accurate. At this time, events in Ulster began to draw to a climax. Asquith's government was in the process of forcing through the Third Home Rule Bill, and the Ulster Volunteers had been formed to resist any attempt to impose Home Rule on the province. Wilson had no doubts that the Unionists would set up a provisional government and would resist the attempt to impose Home Rule. He felt it unlikely that the King would give his assent to Home Rule, and thought it inconceivable that the government would ever send the army into Ulster to force Home Rule through. He knew that if the army were forced to coerce loyal Ulster, men would refuse to obey orders. A split in the army would be disastrous at this stage with the European war on the horizon. At all costs, he did not want a standoff between the army and the volunteers. Whenever he could, he urged that the Unionists should avoid provocation, and he attempted to discourage Lord Roberts from accepting command of the Ulster Volunteers. In March 1914, he was in Belfast, and he returned with the analysis that the UVF were in deadly earnest, adding that as neither the Cabinet nor Englishmen are in earnest about anything, Ulster was certain to win. There is criticism of Wilson for having involved himself in politics, but he knew that if there was a civil war in Ulster, all his plans for the forthcoming war would be useless. The so-called Curragh Mutiny in the spring of 1914 presented Wilson with another opportunity to challenge accepted political judgment. The idea that the British Army could crush loyal British citizens, and that in so doing it would use officers, many of whom had connections with Ulster, seemed to him ludicrous. His ill-concealed contempt for politicians became more and more overt. By then, Director of Military Operations, Wilson was one of the two senior officers who would be expected to order the Ulster officers at the Curragh camp to proceed against their kith and kin. This Wilson refused to do, and the unwelcome burden was passed on to Director of Military Training, General Robertson. When it became clear on January 20th, 1914, that officers would prefer dismissal rather than serve against Ulster, Wilson did not hesitate. Along with Brigadier Hubert Gowf, who commanded the cavalry brigade at the Curragh, he wrote to the Secretary of State for War, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, and the Adjutant General asking whether Ulster officers would be used against Ulster or not. They managed to force an admission from General Sir John French, CIGS, that the military would not be employed to coerce Ulster into accepting Home Rule. In fact, Wilson's letter did more because French's note could be construed as an admission that he had superseded the instructions received from the government. In a welter of mutual recrimination, French eventually resigned to the satisfaction of Wilson. The government's view of Wilson at this time is best detailed in the private diaries of Prime Minister Asquith, who said that he had been playing on the inner plottings of the Ulster Party. Asquith wrote that he was strongly tempted to send him for a while to cool his head and his heels, a disciplinary step which he well deserved. When the war came, Wilson was well placed to play a key role in British strategy. His biographer, Basil Collier, stated that Wilson was a brilliant military thinker whose skill and judgment might have transformed the French army's dream of beating the Germans in 6 weeks into a reality had his advice been followed. Collier's verdict of Wilson is that he was by far the most wide-awake and many-sided of the small band of British soldiers who rose to fame in the First World War. He also had the distinction of having been the most thoroughly maligned of possibly any public figure of the last half-century. Certainly, Lloyd George regarded him highly, and when he became Prime Minister, he often sought Wilson's advice. On many occasions, Wilson was at odds with Haig, a man almost his opposite in temperament. Wilson's influence on Lloyd George increased towards the end of the war, and he played a key role in his post as Chief Liaison Officer with the French. He was appointed to the War Policy Committee, but he trusted Lloyd George no more than he had trusted Asquith. Finally, in February 1918, in the teeth of opposition, Lloyd George appointed Wilson Chief of the Imperial General Staff. At this distance, it is hard to imagine that when he came to office, many believed that the war was lost. Wilson was not perturbed by the gloomy situation and threw himself into his new appointment. Lloyd George wrote, "It was a delight to hear him unravel and expound a military problem. At this critical juncture of the war, he knew what he wanted and was not diplomatic in insisting that others gave it to him." His role in those critical days was never fully appreciated in the United Kingdom. But as Sir James Craig said in Stormont when news of his murder broke, his name was really a monument amongst the whole of the countries of Europe. They recognized in him a great man, and they knew that towards the winning of the war, no single person lent so much as our late comrade and friend. The government recognized his contribution with a baronetcy, £10,000, and the rank of Field Marshal. After the war, Wilson pushed for his long-standing demand that the army would be given a proper lead by the politicians in the formulation of their foreign policy. He was with Lloyd George at the peace conference at Versailles. When he met President Woodrow Wilson, he was his usual undiplomatic self. The president sought to claim kinship based on their common surname and Ulster background. He said, "Ours is a good name," and received the tart rebuttal, "I used to think so," from the Field Marshal. During all this time, problems in Ireland continued to worsen. He was demonized by his opponents because he considered the IRA to be rats, gunmen, and murder gangs. He had earned the enmity of Irish nationalists by his constant advocacy of conscription for Ireland during the war. When there was talk of a peace conference, his view of the IRA was we should crush them, not breakfast with them. And in a phrase which is echoed in present times, he said, "I do not shake hands with murderers," at the time of the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. He backed his soldiers to the full in spite of direct threats to himself and his family. His brother James was told by the IRA that the family home at Currygrain would be burned as a reprisal for military action, and that if he, James, tried to leave, he would be executed. James's response was that this would make no difference to his brother. Yet for all his reputation as an inveterate opponent of terrorism, Wilson was appalled by the introduction of the black and tans. At the height of the Troubles, Wilson changed career when on February 23, 1922, he was returned unopposed as the Unionist MP for North Down. Sir James Craig also asked him to act as military advisor to the Stormont government. His views on the defence of Ulster later resulted in the establishment of the A, B, and C specials. It became increasingly clear that Wilson was one of the key men in the war against IRA terrorism, and he became a hate figure for the Republicans. It was decided that he must be killed. On June 22, 1922, Wilson had unveiled a war memorial at Liverpool Street Station and was returning to his house at 36 Eaton Place. Lying in wait for him were two IRA men, Reginald Dunn, a former Irish Guardsman, and Joseph O'Sullivan, a former private in the Royal Munster Fusiliers. As he went up the steps, the first shot was fired, but it missed. At this point, Collier describes Wilson as making a brave man's blunder. Instead of seeking refuge, he drew his sword and faced his enemies. This time, the shot did not miss. He died almost instantly. Sir James Craig led the tributes. In the Northern Parliament, he said, "Sir Henry Wilson has laid down his life for Ulster. A short time ago, I had occasion to ask his assistance in our hour of trial and trouble, and in difficulty, and his answer was very characteristic. No hesitation, no thought necessary. He said, 'You need hardly have asked me. Now that you have, all that I can do for you shall be done for the cause of my country.' I believe the acceptance of that request cost him his life, and I'm sure that he would not have it otherwise. A more gallant or a finer soldier never stepped. He has laid down his life just when he was emerging after a long time of service to the Empire and to the country that he loved. It has often been said that Ulster has produced men who have lived in her very midst, who were an honour to their country, to their empire, and yet their greatness was not recognised by the people among whom they lived. The two murderers were caught and hanged, but not before a campaign for their pardon based largely on their former war service and the need not to inflame relations with the Irish government. Wilson received a military funeral and was buried at St. Paul's Cathedral. But the real relevance for us today is not just the loss of one of Ulster's greatest leaders, but the role of Irish republicanism in the guise of Michael Collins in the murder. Though denied at the time, there is now little doubt that Collins ordered the murder. The public face of Irish republicanism, Arthur Griffiths, as head of the provisional government in Dublin, stated that the vast majority will be unanimous in condemning and deploring this anarchic deed. But history now recognises that at the same time, Collins remained in close contact with the IRA's murder gangs and was prepared to use them to further his own political agenda. Wilson was to be killed because of his role in organising the security campaign in Ulster. Then, as in more recent times, it has suited some in power to conceal the real nature of Irish republicanism because of their involvement with its violent wing. Thank you for watching another video brought to you by the British Unionist Society. Please hit the like and subscribe buttons to help us produce more content in the future. Please also share this video and help keep alive the memory of a great soldier and patriot. Until next time, take care.